Hello and welcome to the Director's Cut. Today, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Cecilia Alemani, the Director and Curator of the High Line, a very unusual space, which is why we are so eager
I got it. I'm already on.
A chance to listen to her. Just to set the stage, the High Line is an elevated freight rail line transformed into a public park on Manhattan's West Side. It was to be demolished because it was no longer in use, but the community residents organized themselves into the Friends of the High Line and fought to save it. And now they are all responsible for maintaining and running it after it opened in 2009. Here's the interesting part. The walkway is just 8 feet wide and about 1.5 miles long. But it is more than just a space where you enjoy beautiful vegetation that grows naturally. It is also one of the most extraordinary art spaces, the vision for which has been led by Cecilia over the last 10 years. I love the way she describes the space that she works with, a museum without a ceiling. In addition to her commitments at the High Line, Cecilia served as the artistic director of the first edition of Art Basel Cities in Buenos Aires in 2018. And the previous year, she was curator of the Italian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. She is now the artistic director of the 59th Biennale in Venice that has been postponed by a year to 2022 because of the pandemic. As you can see, she is a woman with a lot on her plate. So let's just dive into the conversation. And a quick reminder before that to send in your questions to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. And in the last 10 minutes, we'll take some questions. Cecilia, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be with you all.
As we are. I thought we'd start with the Biennale because that is probably where your attention is going to be focused for the next few months. And you've had so many questions about the challenges of choosing artists and works for the exhibition without being able to travel to see them. But before we come to that, could we explore the idea of whether the pandemic has become a sort of watershed moment for us in the art world as well? Has it, or will it change in some very fundamental way the whole process of the way art is conceived, presented, and shared in the future? Or if I could be more specific, has it altered the way you have conceived the Biennale? Does it impact it in any material sense, or will we all just wander into those marvelous spaces as if it's business as usual and it's just the 59th Biennale that we are seeing a year later than it was meant to be?
Well, you know, it's a complex question because it's a complex situation. So I think a few remarks on what it meant to organize such a large exhibition in this past 14 months. Of course, one of the biggest challenges for me was not to be able to travel. And you know, that's usually the best part of organizing such a global exhibition, is that you get to know so many different art scenes and cultures, which of course I might be familiar with, but being there, as we all know, is so important. And that's, in a way, it's the paradox of my situation, for which on one side, I had more time because the show was postponed. But on the other side, I basically had to do my entire research and preparation on my computer, which has been mentally extremely exhausting. But at the same time, I want to say that having done literally hundreds of Zoom studio visits, on one side, I actually was able to meet more artists because I saved the time of travels and moving from place to place. So I actually, probably I have met more artists than I would have if I were traveling to these places. And something that was surprising to me is that even through the mediation of the screen and through Zoom, I was able to have very honest and very kind of intimate conversations with the artists. Maybe sometimes, you know, as a curator, when you go for a studio visit, sometimes there is this sort of tension, but a little bit of embarrassment of this person that is, it's a stranger that comes to your studio and you sort of
invading your space.
yeah, and you have to kind of perform. In a way, with Zoom, you kind of get rid of that. And I thought I was able to actually capture more. I mean, of course, you know, you don't get to see the work in person, but I think the intimate conversations that I had with the artists were really extraordinarily important in kind of converging in the theme of the exhibition and in the preoccupations that the exhibition wants to capture. And I do think those conversations likely would not have happened normally in a studio visit. So that's the good part. And then, you know, I think I think the Biennale will happen. For many people, will be very much business as usual. You know, I was just in Venice a few weeks ago for the Architecture Biennale, which just opened at the end of May, and it felt, I hate to say normal, but it felt quite quiet and accessible, and you know, there are very small things that probably a visitor wouldn't even notice. You know, everything becomes like access-wise becomes more digital. Of course, you have digital tickets, but it's nothing, you know, Venice still had paper tickets. So I think there are small things that are changing, that are just kind of improving the system, but the experience of the exhibition of the Architecture Biennale was very much, was fairly similar to the past.
Okay, so I'm glad to hear that, you know, because we always think of the serendipity of little conversations that you have in person and things that you stumble on. But it's great to hear that you were able to overcome that and manage to go through and get the artists that you want, or have the conversations that you wanted. I actually wanted to talk now a little about the title of the Biennale itself and the theme for the Biennale, The Milk of Dreams. So that's the title and the theme. And the name is borrowed from a book by Leonardo Carrington, a surrealist artist whose stories describe, and I quote, a magical world where life is constantly re-envisioned through the prism of the imagination. But her work is both fanciful and terrifying at the same time. And I would like to ask you to give us a sense of the several ideas that this theme unpacks, because from all that I've read, the starting point seems to be a more sustainable relationship between man and the world he lives in.
Yeah, so as you say, the title I chose for Venice is The Milk of Dreams, or Il latte dei sogni in Italian. And it is taken by this little book that the surrealist artist Leonora Carrington put together when she lived in Mexico City, because she's a British artist, but from the mid 40s, she fled Europe for the war and basically relocated to Mexico, where she spent her entire life until she died 10, 11 years ago. So the book is, I find it extraordinary because it talks about hybrid creatures and monsters and, you know, these sort of like fanciful creatures that merged human and animal and machine. And something that I always find fascinating about her is that when she was asked when she was born, she would reply, "I wasn't born, I was made by the encounter of my mother with a machine." So I think this sort of hybridity and transformation and metamorphosis is very much at the core of her her artistic practice. And you see it very well in her paintings and sculptures, but also in the amazing books that she's written, not just The Milk of Dreams, but she has put together incredible short stories and novels. So she's an amazing writer. So I got to her, but also because through her books, and I was really interested in reading. I'm always fascinated by when artists are also writers. But so basically, what the exhibition tries to do is to create like a journey through the metamorphosis of the body and definitions of humanities. And this is where both Leonora's kind of world and the many questions that the artist brought up in these many conversations are converging. So many of the questions that the artist brought up in this kind of time of crisis and reflection and pause were, how do we define life? How do we define humanity? And how can we imagine a world or live in a world where the man is no longer at the center of the universe and measure of all things, as the Enlightenment taught us, but is actually creating a more sustainable relationship with other species, with animals, with plants, even with the non-human and with the planet. And so imagining a kind of horizontal kinship with other beings. And so I think this is something that has been in people's mind. Of course, it's not necessarily just something that is happening now. This is part of what, in philosophy it's called the post-human and post-humanist thought. But I think these questions have become incredibly relevant right now, and in a very accelerated way. So what that means in the exhibition is that there are like three sort of themes or threads or souls. One is the representation of bodies and their metamorphosis. Another one is the relationship between humans and technologies, and finally the connection between bodies and the earth. So while the body is always at the center, I'm interested in exploring what is the relationship with ourselves, with technology on one side. And when I say technology, I mean in a very broad sense, and then with our surroundings.
So a lot of this will actually be influenced by what we as a human race have gone through because of the crisis that we experienced during the last year?
I think so, but not in an illustrative way. So I'm not interested necessarily in, sometimes it might sound a little bit like, the climate change, like the climate. It's not like it's not an exhibition that portrays the world as it is. I'm more interested in the hopeful depiction of the world as it may be or will be in the future. So I'm less interested in, bringing artworks that depict the tragedy of the climate disaster and so forth, but I'm more interested in artists who use that sort of negative energy or this time of crisis to look at the future and propose either alternative or move forward, not just backwards.
Yeah, I really like the way you link the various arts. You take literature, then you link it in some way to visual arts, and it's really lovely to see that interconnection, because I think each of the arts enriches the other, and it's so nice when we are able to link them all. And so many artists have done that before. I think maybe it's time now to come to the High Line, which seems to have an extraordinary number of things going on at the same time, where you can enjoy nature or art, or go jogging, or just people watch. So the High Line what it's done is really expanded the role of contemporary art in public spaces. We'd really like to hear how you go about that, because in India, for example, contemporary art has been limited to certain kinds of people or certain spaces. It's not something that the general public usually goes to. So how have you managed to take art into the heart of the community?
Yeah, so maybe we can pull the first image as I speak. So as you said, the High Line is the public park. Of course it's not necessarily the park that you imagine when you say park in New York City. Usually you think of Central Park, which is of course the more traditional park. What the High Line is built on this bridge that you see in this picture, which was an old train, like railway, built in the 1930s for freight trains. But then in the 80s, it was completely abandoned because it was too expensive to maintain. And then for 2 decades, it was completely abandoned. And then at the end of the 1990s, the city was looking at demolishing it, because what happened is that the people that owned the land under the High Line could not develop because you had a kind of bridge on top of you. But then in 1999, a group of community members, actually it was just two guys, decided to come together and found an organization called Friends of the High Line with the goal of saving the High Line from demolition and turn it into a public park. And so what happened, it took 10 years, which maybe we can do another discussion another time, but it was an incredible effort from the community and from many supporters and the city to, instead of tearing it down, reuse the actual structure, which is made of steel, and just transform it into a public amenity. Back in the 90s, nobody had an idea that this would become, like, I think #3 destination in New York after the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building. But now the High Line has been open since 2009, so over 10 years. And since the beginning, the founders wanted to have art at the as one of the layers. And I think, to me, also as a visitor, one of the most striking aspects of the High Line is that it really is unique in the sense that it brings to the public so many different experiences. So, you know, you have these beautiful, gorgeous gardens that have been designed by this Dutch horticulturalist called Piet Oudolf, who is amazing and really brought a completely new kind of experience to New York City. And then you have, you know, people come also to see the High Line as a sort of industrial reuse project, because now it's so popular, of course, to turn, you know, all buildings and infrastructures into amenities. And then people come also to see the city from a completely different perspective. You're like 10 meters high in the sky, and it's a height that is nowhere to be found in New York. Usually you see the city either from the street or from the skyscraper. And then there's art. So I think the conjunction of these four different experiences is what make the High Line so special. But going back to art, since the beginning, I've been there 10 years ago, from like starting 10 years ago, we wanted to expand also the definition of public art, or what you might expect, because very often, also in New York City, you know, when you think of public art, you think of downtown Manhattan, you think of the Calder, the Mark de Suvre, like heavy steel works, which is, of course, you know, we also love, but in a way for us, there was also the understanding that you cannot present artworks like that usually on the High Line, but just because there is no space. So we turned a challenge into something quite inspirational to expand the program and to think of it a bit outside the box. So for instance, this slide that you see is one of my first projects from 2012, and it's an amazing piece by Ella Natsui, an artist based in Nigeria now. And what he does, you might know him because he weaves together these incredible pieces of basically garbage that could be the bottle caps, so it could be, in this case, there were pieces of barrels. He weaves them together in this beautiful tapestry that then had mirrors inside. So as you walk through, at some point, you know, you would see the sky reflected into it. And so it became this very powerful artwork, which at the same time was quite invisible, and many people maybe didn't even notice it. But what was special for us was also to be able to expand beyond the High Line. So that building that you're looking at where the artwork is installed is not, first of all, it's gone now, but it's weird for me to look at it, but it doesn't belong to the High Line. So we approached the owner and asked if we could use it, because one of the goals of the High Line art project is also to use the city as a giant canvas and as a pedestal. So not necessarily to focus on the High Line. I mean, of course, we do plenty of things on the High Line, but why don't we use all these many blank facades that are everywhere along the park? So that was one of the most successful projects that we did. And then if you please go to the next slide.
This really sounds like a lot of fun. Cecilia, before you move forward, I remember seeing a few pictures of you installing this, and then there was a storm and it was all over the place. Tell us about that. That sounded just quite incredible, because here's this museum without a ceiling and with moving walls.
Yeah, I mean, it was, this was 2012. And, you know, I always make fun of the fact that when I started doing this job, I didn't have a background in public art. And I remember that with the production person that I work with, he kept saying, you know, everything that we do needs to be wind resistant and windproof for 70 miles per hour, which is hurricane wind. And I was like, what are you talking about? I mean, there's never wind in your city. And in September that year, as we were installing this piece, Sandy hit. You remember the big hurricane that came through New York and flooded the entire city. Manhattan was with no power for 7 days. And it, you know, we had this camera installed somewhere, like a time-lapse camera that captured, and the piece was fine because it was indeed, you know, engineered to support winds, but it was kind of shocking. And the weather has gotten worse and worse, you know, like now, because there are so many also new buildings next to the Highline, the winds that come in are completely intense. And so we have to adapt to that as well. But everything that we do is kind of vetted by an engineer and architects, so it's fine. And, you know, something important is that art on the Highland stays on view maximum for 1 year. So we like to rotate them because of many reasons, but also they're not necessarily artworks that are supposed to be there forever.
Okay, so you have to come to Bangalore and teach us how to install art in public places, because we're looking to transform this city as well on something like the Highline, the lines of the Highline. But, you know, but the Highline is now recognized as a space that commissions exceptional projects and encourages dialogues with the surrounding spaces. So have you envisioned this as an experimental space that foregrounds the work of emerging artists rather than established names? And maybe you could show us some more works that you feel have made a difference.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. I like to show the next slide because it's like the opposite. So this is a picture of a large installation by Daniel Buren, the French artist that you all know because of his stripe paintings or installations. And in a way, he decided to cover about 400 meters of a very special section of the Highland that curves with this sort of canopy of flags. So it's almost like you were walking into a painting, and it was accompanied by music. It was a festive celebration of color and space. And so again, sometimes it's important to think that public art doesn't necessarily have to be a bronze sculpture, which we love, by the way, and I'll show you more, but it can also be the joyful experience of the moment that can be also driven by large ephemeral sculptures. And if you go to the next slide, I also show you something that is also quite important for the Highland, which is the passage of time and the season. So here you see 4 slides of an artwork by Rashid Johnson, who is an American artist. And so starting from the top left, this is starting from the top right, that's when the piece was installed in April. And the piece is basically a minimalist cube with this yellow bus inside. And then if you go to the bottom left, you see that's what happens in the summer. So the vegetation starts growing and gets integrated in the piece. And that was very important for the artist who wanted that to be one of the ingredients of her sculpture. Then at the bottom right, you see the beautiful fall colors of the piece that becomes almost one thing, one whole thing with the rest of the landscape. And then at the top left, the piece under the snow, because of course it snows a lot in New York, and we have to keep that in mind as well. But as a rule, we invite artists to really establish a dialogue also with nature and the gardens, meaning that we are never going to cut a tree or bushes to accommodate a piece. Of course, we have to fix them, but other than that, artists have to embrace the fact that sometimes the artwork might be covered by snow, by plants, by birds, and that's the beauty of it, because it really allows, especially the local community, to come back and see the same piece over and over again in completely different circumstances.
It's lovely to see the way this bush in the front on the right corner down. It sort of picks up the color of the artwork, the yellow of the artwork.
Yeah,
So
yeah, there
you can
is
see.
these incredible rhymes that happen. And you know, I wish I could tell you, ah, yes, it was curated by, you know, it was all thought about, but no, it wasn't. But that's, I think one of the also the beauties of public art, and that's why I like that kind of feel more than working in a museum, is that in a way, you know, you can work as hard as you can before to make these works, to think about everything that could possibly happen. But once they're out there, and you can't do anything about them. So I think the most beautiful and rewarding part of this job is really let the work go and see how people embrace, how people or nature or the elements embrace it, because it basically starts living a life outside the curator's hand when it's installed. And so I always love to see like how people actually use the work. Sometimes, you know, you brainstorm so much, and then the most banal thing happens and you're like, ah, I never thought about it. So, but that's actually the beauty of it.
Yeah. Sometimes the art or just nature takes over, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Are there any more pictures that you have? Yeah.
Yeah, please go to the next one, which I think is a funny one.
Yeah.
You know, the Highland is a public park, so it's part of the city of New York City. And this is an artwork by an artist called Josh Klein, who uh, wanted to sort of make fun of what you expect to see in a park. So, you know, sometimes you have vending machines, you want like a bottle of water or whatever. And so what he did, he created this vending machine that looks totally like a sort of fridge that you would see, you know, in a store in a bodega in New York City. And you know, everybody in New York, I'm sure, so they are obsessed with these kind of power drinks and smoothies and like all healthy stuff. And so he created this fridge with these 12, I believe, or 15 different kinds of smoothies, but it actually wasn't a vending machine. So you would approach and realize that actually there was no way of opening the door or putting the money in. And as you got closer, you saw that each bottle had, you know, they list the ingredients on the face of the bottle. And instead of having very healthy things like apple and kale and carrot, it actually was listing these very weird things that were inside the bottles, which were portraits of people from different neighbors in New York City. So there was one about Williamsburg, which is a sort of hipster neighborhood in Brooklyn. And so it would contain kale chips, but also shredded credit card, CDs, and other weird like American Apparel, undies, like all kind of a parody of what you expect to see when you visit those places.
I saw the funniest photograph of this because there were old people standing in a queue outside this, waiting to sort of use the vending machine, thinking they could get a bottle
Yeah,
out.
we even got a fine from the city of New York because we actually were not allowed to have a vending machine. And so they thought it was actually a vending machine, which was really funny. Maybe we go to the next one. And this is, again, it's an early project. Again, it's shocking for me to look at this picture because none of these buildings is still there, like parking lots have been built out. But this was a billboard that was already there and was used for, you know, commercial stuff. But then we convinced the owner to use it to commission projects. And so the piece that you see is by Faith Ringgold, who is a wonderful artist based here in New York. And she's famous for making these gorgeous quilts. And so we reproduced one of the images of a quilt of hers in this large vinyl. This is like 75 feet across, so it's giant. And it's important for us because it's a project that, of course, is very visible from the Highland, but also from the avenue below. So as you drive up 10th Avenue, you can see this. And our goal was to sort of give hints to the public and to the people walking or driving that the Highland is also an art destination, and you can come and appreciate also these incredible artworks that change on a regular basis. Maybe we go to the next one. And this is also a very early project, but something that we've continued doing. This is a Trisha Brown performance, the two people with red clothes on the roof. And this is to say that besides, of course, traditional sculptures, installations, sound pieces, billboard, and murals, we've also done lots of performances. And that to me is on one side is the hardest part, because when you work with people is first it's more complicated logistically, but it is in a way the part that is the most active, that really involves the best part of the Highland, which is its people, the people that come to see. And so we've done a ton of performances on the Highland, off the Highland, but really to capture this energy that comes also for the viewers, and that can really see a performance in a completely different setting than, you know, the black box or the theater or the white cube. So this was a series of dancers on the rooftop of the meatpacking district, which is the south side of the High Line. And then next, I think, is the last one. And then just to conclude with this work, which in a way looked like the most traditional that I've shown you so far. It's a work by Simone Lee. But what's important for us here is that this is a section of the High Line that goes over 10th Avenue, and is the newest section that opened just a few years ago. And if you go to the next slide, it's the only section on the High Line that is not just a very narrow path, but it's a large for our standard. So it's actually still very small, but it's a large gathering space. It's basically a piazza. And so when we were refurbishing it, instead of bringing the sort of usual architectural and design landscape of the High Line, we decided to give art a central spot. So in this kind of rectangular space, we decided that in the middle of it, we would put a plinth, a base, a pedestal, and then we would commission and produce monumental works of art that could change over 18 months, but could really spark conversation, because in a way, this is the only place on the High Line where it's basically a cul-de-sac. It just ends there. There is nowhere else to go. So in a way, the behavior, the use of the space is rather different. So instead of just walking, because that's what you usually do on the High Line, here you can sit, look at the art, be inspired, and have conversation. And so that's, for us, the most important part of this section is really art as a way of triggering conversations about some of today's most relevant topics.
Absolutely, really. Even we're thinking of MAP as, you know, a place that's it's for ideas and conversations, and you get people to come in. So it's like a cultural hub where you have this excitement. Yeah. And you've also introduced a lot of video works as well, right, in this space?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't put any picture, but we have a video program which is called Highland Channel, which my colleague Melanie Kress oversees, and this goes along with the idea of sort of expanding the definitions of public art. So it's very simple. You know, we have a projector, and it's in one of the covered passages, because of course, well, now with LED screen, you could actually do it also during the day, but a while ago when we started, it's just a traditional projector under one of these tunnels, and we have a screen. So it's very integrated in the let's say in the landscape of the High Line. But every night from sunset to the closing of the park, we showcase films and videos by contemporary artists. We curate about 6 programs per year, so the same kind of exhibition happens for a couple of months, but it's a way of bringing moving images to the park. And also there is something unexpected, especially for the general viewer, to encounter a film or like an art video in a park. But it's also a way of bringing sound and bringing music to especially a specific location of the High Line that is not necessarily as gorgeous or well taken as other. So it's a way also of beautifying that space.
Yeah. I want our audiences also to understand the scope of the work that you've really done, Cecilia. And so it would be great for you to tell us about the exhibition that you created for Art Basel Cities in Buenos Aires. Hopscotch, as it was called, you know, I've heard transformed the city and allowed people to experience art in a unique way through the connections that were made between visual arts, urban spaces, and the history of the city. So the name comes from a novel actually by the Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar. And it's really interesting to hear. I want you to hear what Cecilia had to say about it. As for the book and the game, my art program hopscotches through the city, shaping possible journeys and different paths through urban space, creating unexpected connections between sites and artworks. So, Cecilia, is this really the way forward to make sure that art enters the public realm rather than remaining within the four walls of a museum? Just give us a sense of what you did and how it worked.
Yeah, so the project in Buenos Aires was a partnership between the city of Buenos Aires on one side that commissioned this project and Art Basel, the art fair in Switzerland that basically executed it. And so Art Basel invited me to be the curator of the first edition. And the goal of the project was to highlight the incredible art scene that is already in Buenos Aires, and it's really truly wonderful, by also putting Buenos Aires a little bit more on the global art map, because of course Buenos Aires is an incredible place with incredible museums and artists, but it is a little bit off the map just because of its geographic location, because it's very, very south in South America, doesn't have a big biennial like Sao Paulo, for instance, doesn't have an art fair. So the goal was for it to become a destination, exactly like Miami became a destination in the early 2000s when Art Basel happened there, but without the art fair. So there was nothing commercial about this project. There was no art fair, no market, but the goal was recreating what surrounds these big art fairs in terms of cultural vibrancy and effervescence. And so what we did, I was invited to do a large-scale public art projects in the city. And we use incredible, amazing venues that some were small local museums, other were abandoned industrial sites. But the idea was to create a journey through the city of Buenos Aires in neighborhoods, especially that are not necessarily usually the destination for art. And so the idea of taking the Julio Cortázar book called Hopscotch, or Rayuela in Spanish, was because the book, of course, the legendary book by a very important Argentinian artist, is structured in a way that you can read it from the first chapter to the last chapter. Also, you can follow a special structure, like a kind of hidden structure, jumping from one chapter to the other without following a linear narrative. And I like this sort of metaphor of discovering the city and making your own journey through the city. So there were about 18 projects. I would say at least 3/4 of them by local Argentinian artists and then some international artists. But it was a way to invite, especially the local community, to go to places they would never, ever go, especially to see art. And from that perspective, not only looking at this art piece, but also looking back at their own city from the perspective of the art. And so, for instance, one of the interesting parts is that Buenos Aires is it's on the river, but apparently the way it was built is inwards. So there is like the waterfront is not really developed at all. And so we did a lot of projects on the waterfront because it's actually wonderful. And so lots of people just told me that they've never been there in 20 years. And so this was also a way of, rediscovering the city. And also, Buenos Aires has really important museums and galleries, but the public art scene is not particularly relevant. It's still quite traditional. It's more like monuments of the colonizers or whatever, bronze monuments of man everywhere in the city. So it was also nice to be able to work with local artists, but in a very different medium. That could be murals, or it could be performance pieces, or completely different mediums.
Yeah, it's very interesting because here was an exhibition that was looked in at a city particularly, whereas the Venice Biennale really isn't about location, right? It's a huge difference in what you're doing. It's much more international.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Sometimes you go to biennials because you assume you're going to learn a lot about the local scene, or if I go to Sao Paulo, I imagine that I will encounter lots of Brazilian artists. I don't think anyone has that assumption when they go to Venice of seeing Italian art, which of course it's dear to me, and it will be definitely a highlight of my show, but it is definitely a global exhibition. I think it has to do also with the structure of the show itself, which it's not just the international show, but also is based on the national pavilions. There are about 9 national pavilions. So yeah, I think it's just a different experience, and in a way, Venice is also this sort of magical but also invisible, imaginary city. It's a museum itself on its own, but at the same time, I don't know, it's a very dreamy city. So it's not necessarily that. I think there is enough outside for people to appreciate Italian culture as you walk in every single church outside the Biennale. And so the Biennale can actually bring more the international flavor of contemporary art.
Yeah, but next year it's going to be Documenta and Venice in the same year, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it's supposed to be. So we'll see. But it's one of those years where there's a lot, but also it's not just Documenta actually, because the whole kind of calendar of international exhibition has been shuffled around. So I think it's also going to be Manifesta, Berlin Biennale, Lyon Biennale, Documenta. So there is and I think also Istanbul. So there is a lot happening. So.
Yeah, we're all being starved for art. So I think it'll just be wonderful to have so much of choice. Right.
Yeah, I hope so, and I hope it'll be easier to travel. But I'm optimistic. So.
Okay, I'd like to come back to the idea of location. So, in your interview with Andras Zanto, in his wonderful book of dialogues with 28 directors, you spoke of the importance of locations and their history, and the role of museums in reviving those connections for the community. Would you like to frame the location of the High Line for us in the context of the artist communities that lived and worked during the 60s and 70s, and the social history of these neighborhoods and how they helped to shape movements and identities in this district?
Yeah, I mean, the New York is a city that changes all the time. And so one of the reasons of also doing the art program, the High Line, is if you're familiar with where the High Line is in New York City, it's located, part of it is in Chelsea, and Chelsea is now the probably most important art district in America because there are about 400 galleries, there are museums now, there is the Whitney Museum, the Shed on the other side, non-profits. So it is the art district, but it's not always been. And so artists started and galleries started coming in the late 80s when Soho, where they were before, got completely gentrified. And so they kind of moved to the West Side because Chelsea was just an industrial, because of the High Line, it was an industrial neighborhood. The only thing that were there were storages, food companies, and now it's becoming a residential neighborhood, but it wasn't like that. So when we decided to do art, was also on the High Line, was also in a way to celebrate the artistic roots of the neighborhood. And so not only it's a place where like the DR Foundation first moved in the late 80s, and then the galleries came, but then also along the waterfront, along the Hudson River, which is just a few steps away from the High Line, there were lots of piers because that's where the boats would come, but they've been slowly abandoned in the mid of the 20th century. And so starting from the 60s and 70s, those piers were completely derelict, abandoned, but they were starting to be used by artists and activists to hang out or to turn them into exhibition spaces. Most famously, pardon me, Gordon Matta Clark did this incredible famous cut in the pier, which is I could literally see it from the High Line, except that now it's gone. So there was a creativity and a very important scene there that it's very hard to capture in a way and to maintain, just because of course now that side of New York has become extremely gentrified and there are tons of new buildings. But we try also with the art program to sort of celebrate that history as much as we can.
Cecilia, do you need a sip of water? Do you need to get a glass of water? Are you
No,
okay?
I'm okay.
Okay. Okay. I wanted to ask you about how we live in times of political and social turmoil, and cultural institutions find themselves increasingly in the crosshairs of these debates. So, how do we negotiate the way forward so that we do justice to the role of that the institution needs to play, while always also being sensitive to the needs of our community? How do we achieve that fine balance? Because we are living in quite charged times, I would
Yeah.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer, because here, and this is very much part of the American culture. So it's important to remember, I don't think the term balance applies here, because I think here everything is extremely extreme and it's polarized. And I think there is, of course, a lot of debates in museums and cultural institutions about not just about programs and content, but more importantly about funding and where the money comes from and the ethics of the museum. And what I see happening is it's rather extreme. It's nothing that is gray, it's black or white. But I think this very much belongs to the DNA of the American culture, so that in order to make changes, they have to go extreme. And so it's a very tough time, I think. It's a time of rethinking your own institution and reevaluating your values and move forward. But some of these institutions are dinosaurs, and they're never going to be able to change drastically the way some of the younger activists want. So it's I've been kind of witnessing this, and it's on one side extremely important and relevant, and the questions that are raised are extremely important. But at the same time, honestly, I do not see yet any kind of real solution, or like an alternative model to the kind of idea that the museum is this old institution that gets dirty money from rich people. So, we'll see. I think it's some of the consequences of these debates are really important, because they did provoke smaller changes within our institutions, but the radical shift has not happened, and I don't understand. I don't know how it's going to be able to happen in the current model of things, especially here in the States.
Yeah. Well, you're an Italian who's been working for the last 10 years and you've studied in the US as well. But what does it mean to be the first Italian woman director and of the Venice Biennale? And what kind of a responsibility does that bring?
Well, it's of course a great honor, but also, it's sometimes, if you think about it, it's rather shocking that there have been 58 editions of the Venice Biennale since its inception in 1895. And, the first woman curating the Venice Biennale was in 2005, which I think is rather shocking. But I take it as a great honor, and of course, not just being among a group of very wonderful colleagues that have done it before, but also thinking about being Italian and how I can make this edition relevant also for the Italian cultural scene. Of course, everybody's happy that the Biennale exists and lots of people come and go to see also other places, but I want to be a bit more intentional in that, and hopefully it will be also a celebration of Italian culture.
Okay, so I'm going to move to some questions now from our audience, and I can see some of them which have been sent in earlier and have come onto our chat. So this comes from Shanta Mani, an artist, a Bangalore-based artist. Congratulating Cecilia Alemani for being the curator of the Venice Biennale. I would like to ask what method she adopts in finding artists for her curatorial. Does her curatorial encompass other voices in the arts that are not suitable for commercial or gallery art platforms?
It's a process. So I've done a lot of research. Especially because of the restrictions in traveling, I had people that have helped me recommending artists from all over the world, like advisors or correspondents. and I keep looking at things, I don't know how many thousands of portfolios of artists that I just go back to, and I try to be intentional in the fact that I don't just want to work with artists that have a commercial representation, which of course, and the world is also changing. It's those dynamics are very complicated, or maybe very easy to navigate. So I'm trying to make sure that I keep my eyes open and I learn about from all possible platforms. So definitely I don't just look at galleries or museums, but I have to say that, again, going back to the beginning of this conversation, it's been hard not to be able to travel and to assume that everything is on the web. So yeah.
Okay, so there's another question from Nalini Malavia, which seems to be along the same lines. Good evening, Cecilia. Your thoughts on how independent art practitioners, such as curators and artists based in India, connect or collaborate with international art events of significance, for example, the Venice Biennale?
So the question is, how do they do that?
Yeah, how do they get to connect, and how do I suppose showcase their work there is what I think. Or get it noticed.
Yeah, so the Venice Biennale is not just the exhibition I curate, which is of course the main thing. It's called the International Art Exhibition, and so that's fully curated by me. And I run my research. I always listen. I have a website. If something comes from my website, I always try to look at it. But then there are other ways, of course, to participate. There is a national pavilion. I don't know who will do or how the Indian pavilion is organized, but that's an independent contribution to the Venice Biennale. It's still part of the Venice Biennale, an official event, but I'm not part of it. And then there are lots of collateral events that happen in the city of Venice, and it can literally be, of course, I'm not thinking about money, but it can literally be a group of people that decide to do a show about Indian art. An Indian artist finds a venue in Venice, and then a ton of people are going to go see. Of course, I'm idealizing, because you still require fundings to do that and lots of logistics. And those are the the three basic things. And I think somehow one of the most powerful things that happen in Venice is, from a viewer perspective, when you're able to kind of create your own story or your own storytelling among all these different offerings. Because of course my show eventually is going to be overwhelming, because it's going to have over 100 art, and so, but I think as a viewer, I remember just the magic happenings when you find connections also between things that are not necessarily curatorially related. So I might go to my show and see an artwork, and then I go to the French pavilion, and even if it's not the same artist, but there are some references and rhymes that become very important. So it's important. The way I think of my show is not as a closed exhibition, but also as a portal, and as a way that opens different entry points for people to kind of create their own journey through Venice and through the many art experiences that are offered there.
Okay. There's a question now from Radhika Poddar. I think someone's being naughty here. But how do we get you to do a partnership with Bangalore and make parts of the city come alive?
Well, we can talk about it when I finish the show. After the show, I mean, I would love to come to India if I could today, but it's likely going to be a bit later. But yeah, we can talk about it after the big lift of Venice.
Okay, I'm going to club a few questions here. One from Vivian Perez, which says, how many visitors walk the High Line in the summer months? And there's someone at Louis Giansante who says, are there any webcams set up to view the High Line?
So first question, data pre-pandemic. So in 2019, for instance, there were over 8 million visitors coming all year long. I believe the most visited day is Mother's Day, which is in May, at some point in May. And that sometimes is like 55,000 people in one day. So it's like, I don't know, like it depends on the month, like May and June are really busy, but you know, it can be like 500,000 people come in a month in the summer, or like even almost 1 million people. So it's overwhelming. This is not what's happening this year. Of course, now the visitations has dropped tremendously, which, you know, to be cynical, we don't charge admission. So for us to have more people means that we have to raise more money to clean and to maintain the park. And we don't have any income from these people that come. Of course, you know, sometimes they buy coffee there and it's great, but it's not that we have a lot of income. So less people meant also that the experience of walking the Highland has become a bit more pleasant, because the Highland got to a point in which was rather busy. And so that's why the experience was just walking. Now it's amazing to see how people are using the park in completely different ways. They're running, they're jogging, they're having lunch, they're praying. And so we were very happy to see that. Of course, we love having tourists and we'll always welcome everyone, but we got to a point in which we were anyway about to look at solutions to moderate the flux of people. And then webcams, no, I don't think there are, at least not from our organizations. There might be some kind of neighbors there, but I don't know. I don't know of any.
Since you work with living artists, how does your relationship evolve with artists as they mature and their art becomes less or more commercially valuable? That's a question
we like
from
to think of the many, you know, I think now we work with 250 artists since the beginning. We like to think of them as our core community. And so even though we might not work with them anymore because we've done already something, we like to stay in touch and follow their career. And something important for us is that with the exception of the video work, most of the artworks that you see on the Highland are commissioned and produced by us, which means we approach an artist and we give them the budget to create that work. And so it's really like a platform for artists to experience and try something new and something maybe they've never done before. In fact, we don't necessarily like to work with artists that have a lot of public art experience. We like to work with people that have never done it before. They might not do it again, but at least we can provide them with that trampoline. And then we also like to follow what happens to the artworks. You know, most of the time, nothing, but like the fridge that I showed you before with the smoothies has been acquired by the Museum of Modern Art, which of course is an incredible reward for us and for the artist. Or like an earlier piece by Sarah Z is now installed in a beautiful garden in Oslo. So we like to also follow the stories of these artworks as they spread over the world.
Okay, let's end on a glorious note. Food. You are from Milano, and I know it's famous for its high fashion and the Duomo, and of course the Last Supper. So tell us about the food, because Indians are great fans of pasta, and you'll find it in all sorts of small eateries. Of course, the Indian version of pasta. But what is your favorite dish, and do you carry the tastes of Milano across the world with you?
Oh my God, you're gonna make me cry. I miss it so much. It's funny because, you know, people think New York, yes, in New York you can have food from all over the world and it's delicious. But I do miss the food in Milan, and it's just the simplicity of pasta. And the thing I miss the most is any kind of declination of bread, like focaccia and like pizza. It's okay actually here, but like a very good just loaf of bread that is so crunchy and it stays crunchy all day. Here it's just I mean, someone from Naples would tell you it's just a question of the water is different, and so there is no way, unless you import like gallons and gallons of water, you're never gonna make the same kind of bread. But we're lucky to live again in your city, and but I do miss the simplicity of things of Italian cuisine. You know, it's here everything gets richer and bigger, and sometimes less is more.
I know, just a little bit of olive oil and pepper and salt. Sometimes it's just glorious.
Exactly.
I know. Well, that's a lovely note to end on. Cecilia, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I know what a difficult time it is, and there's just so many things happening in your life and your work. But it's been wonderful speaking to you and hearing about what you're doing for the
Thank you for having me.
and at the Highline. It's such an exciting space, and we're happy to bring that to our audiences. I'd also like to thank Anand for the sign language interpretation. And we're screening an episode of Museums Without Borders that places objects from museums in conversations with each other at the end of this. It's a short video of about 8 minutes, wherein we are in conversation with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So Cecilia, if you have to leave, then thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was lovely to be with you, and I hope next time I'll be able to come and be there in person. But let's be in touch and come to Venice if you can.
We will.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody. Bye.